All right, neutral cards. Let's jump in. We'll start with the commons. Jeweled Scarab. So this is kind of like the Gnomish Inventor style thing. 1/1 for 2. The fact that it's a beast could be relevant for a number of different decks. We could see this played in like mid-range style Hunter decks potentially. We could see it played in Beast Druid perhaps. The fact that it's Battle Cry, discover a 3-cost card, is pretty relevant. It guarantees that you're able to fill in your curve the following turn. It can get spells, so if you're playing a class that has a lot of 3-cost spells you don't necessarily want to play on 3, like Mage, with a bunch of secrets, maybe not as strong in those classes. I like this use of Discover as like a resource gain mechanic as opposed to drawing cards. Both, I think there's a more interesting dynamic to it, like I discussed earlier, the fact that adding cards to your deck from outside the game, it has relevant strategic value in games against other control decks that are likely to go to fatigue. But I also just think that drawing cards in Hearthstone, and in particular being able to find specific individual cards or draw your entire deck, has long been too easy. When you have lots of easy ways to draw cards and thus the ability to effectively draw your entire deck or most of your deck on a regular basis, it just causes games to play out super similarly. We see that a lot with Freeze Mage. But when you have cards like this, which not only are not actually increasing the consistency of your draws, but also bringing in something else from outside the game into your deck, it significantly increases the variety of gameplay, which I think is very valuable. Tomb Spider. 4-cost 3/3 beast, Battlecry, discover a beast. Similar thoughts to the Scarab, though I think this card is worse. Spending 4 mana for a 3/3, hashtag feels bad, man. I think this is more of a like arena style card than it will likely be a constructed card, but it is effectively like a 3/3 for 4 draw card, which is kind of like a Gnomish Inventor style card in terms of the value you're getting out of it. But it isn't increasing your deck consistency in that way. So I think that this is a pretty cool card. Maybe it could see play in like really attrition based decks in metagames, but seems difficult to justify playing this over something like a Paladin Shredder. Murloc Tiny Fin. Power creep, oh my god! I think it's a hilarious argument that this is power creep over Wisp because it's a Murloc and that makes it better than Wisp. It's in some ways true. It also makes it vulnerable to Hungry Crab, so it's not strictly better. But I think that this is actually interesting on a number of levels. One, I think it's a strong card for Murloc decks. Being able to make stuff like Tide Hunter relevant faster, being able to have more cheap minions that you can play to enable things like your War Leaders, helps enable all those sort of synergies. Things like every Fin is awesome. It's basically a coin for that also gets buffed. It does make Murloc Knight possibly able to summon an even weaker thing than it could before. But it also is a strong card with Hobgoblin. It improves a number of interesting decks from multiple angles. Because it's a Murloc, it's a 0-cost Murloc, and just because it's a 0-cost 1/1, decks that are looking to potentially like leverage any of those particular cross-cutting synergies have this as a tool, which I think is interesting. Huge Toad. It is very sad that this isn't just the feels bad man like emote as a card, because that's basically what it is. But Death Rattle, deal 1 damage to a random enemy, 3/2 beast for 2. I think this is also just kind of just filling out the beast curve with more stuff that's relevant. Oh my god, power creep from Bloodfin Raptor. Oh my god. For those of you who are not catching my sarcasm, power creep is essentially a relevant concept when it refers to cards that are already sort of powerful and used in competitive decks. When a card that isn't played like has a card that is better than it printed, that isn't power creep really. That's just putting things into a position that cards in that category might see play. Huge Toad is interesting though. Like this is kind of like a flame. Obviously Flame Jugger is the battle cry version of this with somewhat reverse stats. I think that Huge Toad is potentially an exciting card in sort of a mid-range style of Hunter deck against like an aggressive deck. Like Huge Toad can kill your opponent's like Leper Gnome and their Wolf Rider and their Abusive Sergeants. It is a pretty powerful effect, even though it's often going to do nothing. When it does something that is board impactful, it's extremely effective because there's a huge tempo swing. So I actually think this is a card that could see a significant amount of play. Both because it's just combination of stats and ability are pretty relevant in some cases, and the fact that it's a beast. So It's also a huge toad. Feels good, man. Fossilized Devil Soar. Battle cry: if you control a beast, gain taunt. 8/8 for 8. So this is kind of like an iron bark protector. In this scenario that you can't, you don't have access to Iron Bark Protector. Mostly looks like it's a card that could potentially be relevant in Arena. I do think that cards like this are interesting for Arena, things that are rewarding you for particular kinds of synergies. And I like the fact that this is a card that is outside of a class that rewards you for that. Yeah, it's like you can look at your deck that you've drafted in Arena and be like, oh, how many beasts do I have? Is it possible that Fossilized Devil Soar is particularly good in my deck? So that's cool, and whether it's a powerful card or not is it is clearly a powerful card. Iron Bark Protector in games that go long is quite powerful, but I think that this is certainly the type of card that makes drafting Arena decks more interesting, because the more they are able to have synergies that can manifest, makes the actual drafting process more fun. Gorillabot A3. If you control another mech, discover a mech. 3/4 for 4. Much like the Beast one, this is kind of the same style of card. Again, this is sort of weird in that it's competing very clearly with something like Piloted Shredder as far as tempo. This is more of a long game value style card, whereas Shredder is more impactful tempo wise. I do like all these types of cards here. I guess this also requires you to control a mech to discover a mech, so it's not just like the other one, but worse. So this has a conditional trigger. I do just wish they were differentiated more. I wish that they were not just this virtually the same stat line and at the same cost. I like any cards that are sort of tribally synergy based. I think that makes deck building more interesting. Not necessarily just the pure always want the same type cards, but something like this, which rewards you for tribal synergy, I think is interesting in both Arena and Constructed. A Basalt Sentinel. Death Rattle, give a random friendly minion +3/+3. This is a very powerful Death Rattle effect. The problem is that it's on a relatively weak body that your opponent can likely kill your other stuff and then kill in their own turn in many cases. It feels like the sort of card that's probably really powerful when you're ahead, because your opponent isn't able to just trade into your other stuff then kill it. Because even if you can just trade this into something with one other guy in play, it's extremely strong. So I think this is actually a very, very, very powerful card, likely in Arena. Probably borderline-ish for Constructed. Probably won't see play in tournament decks, though. Wobbling Runts. This card's hilarious. 6 cost 2/6, Death Rattle, summon 3 2/2 runts. So, just 3 guys in a coat, pretend to be a big guy. This is actually a pretty strong card. You're getting a ton of stats for what you're spending on it. It's very similar to a worse version of Savannah Highmane. So if you're in the market for Savannah Highmane, kind of sweet. But the fact that it is in Cabal range is also is kind of disastrous. I think this is likely to be a reasonable card in Arena, just because it's pretty high value, but it is very low tempo because it does very little damage for its cost. So I think it's more of a fun conceptual card than it is likely to be a competitive card. Summoning Stone. This is the Tavern Brawl made real. And I think this is a cool card because it is rewarding you pretty heavily if you are playing expensive spells. This goes super well with Force of Nature and things that are giving you board impact immediately. I don't think its health is high enough to really try and build a deck around this. I think if this had 8 health, maybe this would be a card that you could try and build a deck that legitimately used it in a competitive capacity, because it would be pretty likely to be able to survive. But at 6 health, it just feels like it is really, really low impact, difficult to keep around long enough to take advantage of. Erie Statue. So this is 7/7 for 4. Cannot attack unless it's the only minion in the battlefield. Wouldn't it be only minion on the battlefield? I just think that text-wise that makes not much sense. Anyway, this is kind of a neat card. It encourages you to use board wipe effects, and it's a card that you want in a low minion count deck, or at least a deck that has very few early game minions. The fact that it can't attack unless your opponent has no minions, if this couldn't attack unless it was the only minion you controlled, I think it'd be super good. But you have to also just be able to kill all your opponent's other minions to get this guy to be able to attack, and do so with spells and weapons, because can't attack if there's other minions. So I don't know. This is a neat card that I think will encourage people to try and take advantage of it. This is, though, at the same time, it's a card that I think actually kind of illustrates the problem with Big Game Hunter in a pretty clear effect. Like, if you wanted to build an Erie Statue deck, like, you'll just get punished by people who are playing Big Game Hunter, even if you are able to finally reach the conditional. It's like, okay, your opponent's able to kill your stuff. Okay, well, it just gets Big Game Hunter. Sorry. So I think this would be a cool card that people might try to build decks around if it weren't so easily countered by such a popular card. All right, Ancient Shade. A 7/4 for 4 Battlecry shuffle an Ancient Curse in your deck that deals 7 damage to you when drawn. It's kind of cool. I don't know if the Ancient Curse is also like the Mine or whatever, that you draw a card to replace it. If you don't draw a card, it's a lot bigger deal. But it's also, again, this is a card with a pretty huge drawback. Has big stats, but very easy to kill, and dies Big Game Hunter. So it's cool, but it's probably not going to see anywhere near as much play as something like a Fel Reaver, which is harder for your opponent to deal with, and has ultimately a smaller drawback in most games. Yeah, just dies to True Silver, dies to Shredder. Not worth it. Nagas Sea Witch. This is a cool card. So Nagas Sea Witch is a card that you can definitely just build decks around. You can play 2 copies of this. It's one of the important things about like decks you can actually build your decks around. Like a lot of legendary cards, it's difficult to build a deck around a legendary. If it's like, a card that like something like Baron Rivendare. It's like you can play Baron Rivendare in a deck, and sometimes it'll come up and its synergies will manifest, but like you only ever draw that every so often because it's a legendary card. Nagas Sea Witch, though, is a card that you can actually play in any deck, and you can play 2 copies of it, and it's really cool because like you can potentially play it and another card that costs however much mana in the same turn. Obviously, you already have 10 mana, so if you played it alongside something that costs 10, you already could have played the thing that costs 10. But if you play this on like turn 5 and your opponent doesn't kill it, like you can play Aviana next turn or whatever. You can play Deathwing, whatever else, and that's all pretty cool. So I like that this is a sort of card that can spawn like an entirely new deck. I don't know if this deck will be good, but it is really interesting in how it will allow you to potentially like try to build around it with these big powerful legendaries. I'm also curious how this plays with Aviana, as I just mentioned. Like Aviana says your minions cost 1. This says your cards cost 5. Who wins in a fight? Jin of Zephyrs. Whenever you cast a spell on another friendly minion, cast a copy of it on this one. Pretty cool with Hunter's Hat or whatever, the Explorer's Hat. You can, get extra copies on this guy, and then he gains the Death Rattle effect. You get even more hats. Oh my god. I think it's cool that there are more cards that care about targeting your minions. Like we've seen Lightbane and Darkbane Sisters. We've seen Dragonkin Sorcerer. And I hope that we will get to the point that there's enough of those that like that's a strategy you can build toward with something like Druid, with Mark of the Wild, Priest, with like Powered Shield and Valen's Chosen, whatever else. But the Hunter too with the hat, more hats. All right, we're into the legendaries now, and this card is super cool. Elise Starseeker, shuffle the Map of the Golden Monkey into your deck. Map of the Golden Monkey is a spell that shuffles the Golden Monkey into your deck. And you draw a card, and the Golden Monkey is the 4-cost 6/6 taunt. It has the battle cry of your hand and deck become legendary minions, which is super cool. I am definitely going to be building decks, like trying to utilize this. I don't think that it's actually like a particularly strong competitive strategy, but it's certainly a cool and fun strategy. And again, I've mentioned this a number of times, and I think it's important that those things just exist, even if they're not competitive. That there are things that people spend their time and energy trying to explore because they are just cool and fun. I do think that it's possible that like you can build a deck that does utilize this effect very well. Like you can play a deck that is almost all like just cheap removal effects and control style cards, and you don't even necessarily need to play like big late game minions to win the game, because you can ultimately just try and control the game with all your removal, and then Golden Monkey. Okay, now I just win the game from here. It does remove your ability to like interact efficiently at that point. So it's not just like a pure like upside, hey, Golden Monkey, I did it. But I do think that it does change the dynamic of the way that you can construct your deck. thanks to that Battlecry effect. All right, Bran's Bronzebeard, or rather, Bran Bronzebeard. So this is certainly a really cool card. Your battle cries trigger twice. So my understanding is that the way this works is that if it is a targeted battle cry effect, it targets the same thing twice. So it doesn't actually give you bonus effects from things like Big Game Hunter. If you do play it with like Fire Elemental, it only actually shoots the same thing twice. So you can kill a 6/6 with a Fire Elemental, but you can't kill 2 separate 3/3s. And this is the sort of card, kind of like I was just talking about with Baron Rivendare, is like, I'd love to build a deck around this, but you need more incentive. You need because you can only play one copy of Bran Bronzebeard, it's difficult to ensure that you're actually going to draw him. And this is actually, I think, one of the things with like the cheap legendary cards, like high cost legendary cards, because you will spend more of the game getting to that point. You'll naturally draw them by the time you have enough mana to cast them more often. Whereas the games that you'll draw Bran when you have 3 mana is like relatively low. But I do think that with this in combination with other things that reward you with battle cries, like the Rumbling Elemental and Shaman, could be cool, because you have a lot of things that sort of cross-cutting synergies. That like, okay, well, if I draw Bran, great, these things do this. If I draw the Rumbling Elemental, I still am rewarded for my battle cry effects. But I do think this is a very powerful card, with things that draw cards, with things that discover, with things like, Defender of Argus, or Fire Elemental again, or Varian or whatever. Like, it's a super powerful card when it is online. So maybe it's better off that it doesn't come up as often, that it is a legendary card, but it does make it harder to build a deck around. But definitely, this is definitely a card that I will be building decks around, and I do think that it is certainly extremely strong. All right, Sir Finley Mergleton. He is 1/3 for 1. Battle cry, discover a new basic hero power. So the fact he's a 1-cost 1/3 Murloc in itself is like kind of an interesting thing, because it does help provide a stable body for like Murloc decks if they do care about having Murlocs in play with things like War Leader. The battle cry, discover a new basic hero power. It's weird because this is a card that could be very strong in a lot of decks that like want to do something that is different from what their class drives them to do in general. Like if you wanted to play an aggressive warrior deck or aggressive priest deck, or I don't know, any shaman deck, you may want a hero power different than the one that the game naturally gives you. So this is a way that you can do that, and I think that it's possible that this card will end up seeing a lot of play in any of those sort of decks, because this isn't like, oh, you play it in this kind of deck. It's like you actually just play this in any deck that is trying to do something different than what its hero power naturally pushes it to do. Something like like aggro priest or control hunter or aggro warrior, or any number of these things, and that's actually a hallmark of I think a pretty cool card, because it can have a role across a lot of different places. So I will definitely be trying to play some of these decks, like Control Hunter, like Aggro Warrior, and the like. And I imagine Sir Finley Mergleton will find a home in all of them. All right, Reno Jackson. So this is another card that really changes the way that people might think about playing and building their decks. So from my understanding, the way this battle cry works is that it looks at your deck currently, not your deck as a whole. So like you don't have to build your deck with just one copy of everything in it. You can build a deck that has 2 copies of some cards, but if they have more than one card remaining in your deck when you play him, his ability won't trigger. So this is, again, something that is a very powerful effect that can really swing games dramatically when you are playing against a deck where this is a key element of the game. Like if you're playing against something like Freeze Mage, if you're playing against something like Face Hunter, any aggressive deck, really, this is an incredibly strong effect when you are able to pull it off. And I can imagine, playing decks that are like pretty, are using more different cards as a result, because you can play like, instead of playing double, like if you have decks that are like have lots of possible analogous effects, like you probably wouldn't play this in like Druid, because Druid most of the time is going to pretty much always want to play 2 Wild Growths, 2 Innervates. But if you're like playing a deck that has more options at various costs, like generally going to be a control deck because this is an effect that is most powerful in a control deck. But you can have an entire variety of different things that are around the same general goal. So it's interesting. This is a card that inherently pushes you to do things that are different. To have games, build decks in such a way that games will play out differently because more different cards are likely to be involved. So certainly a very cool card, and I will definitely be building my Highlander style decks to take advantage of it. Because there can be only one. And last, and perhaps least, Archthief Rafaam. So our dramatic villain of the whole story is a 7/8 for 9 with Battlecry. Discover a powerful artifact. And the powerful artifacts, let's find those real quick. They are Mirror of Doom, Timepiece of Horror, and Lantern of Power, which fill your board with 3/3 zombie mummies, deal 10 damage randomly split among all enemies, and give a minion +10/+10. So, I mean, yes, these are pretty powerful in the right circumstances. Giving a minion +10/+10, obviously pretty strong. But spending 9 mana on a 7/8 that has no other immediate impact in the game is kind of sad. I imagine that in really attrition-based matchups, like something like the Mirror of Doom could be very strong. I'm kind of sad that none of these are cards that can get you back into a game when you're really losing. I mean, obviously, fill your board with 3/3 zombies. If you are really far behind on the board, that's great. But all of them are things that if you spend your turn 9 playing this thing and you're really far behind on the board, that you can't cast it. I mean, I guess you could theoretically cast Timepiece of Horror and hope that you kill all your opponent's minions, but it costs your entire turn. So I'm not really buying this card. I think that it's cool, but not really something that looks like it's going to be nearly as effective as a lot of the other options that already exist. I mean, compare this to Ysera. Compare this to, even Nefarian. Nefarian is very, very similar. Obviously, you don't get any individual. You're very unlikely to get any individual card as strong as these from Nefarian, but you get 2 of them, and you also get Dragon's Energies, which is pretty important. I'm pretty unimpressed by the powerful artifacts. They are obviously all pretty high impact things, but they all cost 10 mana. So you're effectively using your entire turn, 2 turns, before you can actually play any of these. So maybe they're good. I'll definitely try them, but thus far I'm certainly not excited by any of the artifacts.